So this is sort of a great segue into this sort of UHI, future conversation that maybe we touch on for a little bit. So one of the amazing things about Lemonade that you described earlier was the sort of the operational leverage that you're now experiencing, where your costs are remaining static, meaning that the number of employees, the systems you're on, et cetera, everything, variable, fixed costs, whatever, kind of the same. People leave, people come, but it's about the same. And then the business explodes upwards, right? 10x's, 100x's, whatever. Just move the time forward. When you have a master insurance AI brain that I'm sure it will develop at some point, that's going to be able to make every decision in your company better than any human could combined. No disrespect, but that's just the fact. That's where we're going. Yeah. Then, in theory, you're going to have the most advanced brain to do insurance for humanity. And so there's going to be this magnetic effect that's going to cause a lot of people to choose Lemonade, because you'll have the lowest cost and the best service, the highest quality, the best everything, the best processing time, whatever. But then that also means that not a lot of people are going to be able to join Lemonade and work for Lemonade, because there's no incentive there to be that to exist. Okay, so and let's say Lemonade is one of the first breakthrough companies that people start realizing that this is happening, and the stock goes up 1,000 times, and you guys are a $10 trillion market cap, whatever. Like, we can fast forward into the future, whatever that means. But if it's going to happen with Lemonade, and people watch this video, a lot of entrepreneurs watch this video, a lot of people that work in AI are seeing this themselves, then we're going to navigate down this world where we're going to have hopefully a lot of companies that are massive disruptors in their space, that's going to disrupt legacy businesses. So Lemonade in insurance, Tesla in automotive, go down the list of all these other Upstart in finance, and Robinhood in finance, and Palantir in software, right? All these companies start essentially putting all the legacy industries out of work. And by default, all those legacy industries are slow and old and inefficient, which is a byproduct of employing a lot of people, right? And so that means that it is likely that we're going to go down a path where we're going to have an enormous, gigantic explosion of extremely valuable companies, but it seems like we're going to need a lot less people to run them. So that feels like giant disruption to the labor force, giant dislocation of the labor force. It's going to empower a lot of individuals to do their own thing, but we are also going to have I think a significant subset of the human population that's sort of going to be like, what the hell just happened, right? And you mentioned sort of, you've been thinking about this a lot, and you've mentioned a lot of people in the front of the AI lines have been thinking about this a lot. We talked about the Moonshot podcast and a bunch of other podcasts that the All-In guys talked about it with Tucker Carlson as well. I'm glad it's becoming conversation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because it feels like the question of our time. It's a very serious conversation to have. Any thoughts or ideas you could share there would be super valuable, I think, for all of us.
It is. I'm glad it's, as you are, I'm glad that it's becoming a question that's being talked about a lot more and taken seriously, because I think that if you map out all the possible futures, too much of that space is taken up with mass and permanent and growing unemployment. So a few things. And I think actually if you wanted to capture the essence of the the AI transformation, the AI revolution, you would have to say, in its most succinct form, it's about replacing labor with capital. That's really what it is. It's about using capital to do things that once required labor. And that kind of disruption is I was about to say unprecedented. Of course, the Industrial Revolution saw 90% of farmers go out of work, but then there were still aspects of work that needed to be done where we outperformed. These were dumb machines. So we had brains. We had an exclusivity of a brain. And now we're going to lose that exclusivity. And I think the right way to think about this is that intelligence is going to be infinite and free. And it won't entirely be infinite, it won't entirely be free, but I think you round up to there and you start realizing what that means. And the blast radius for that is huge, because so much of how we structure our lives and our economies is predicated on the notion that intelligence is pretty rare and takes many years of training to hone. And that kind of scarcity is what allows top engineers and top doctors and top lawyers to command the kind of salaries that they do. So everything about how we think about so many aspects of society is going to be upended by this. No question. If intelligence is infinite and free, that's a pretty big deal. I tend to think about a solution to the problem as the nature of the problem and the solution to the problem requiring kind of at least two steps. I think about the Maslow hierarchy, but we have to start with some kind of distribution of all of that abundance, because left to market forces alone, it won't end well.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution didn't start well. I know we think it had a happy ending, but you read Charles Dickens and you see what it was like for people who weren't factory owners, and life was short and brutish, and their standards of living did not increase just because GDP grew. GDP grew in a very uneven way, and it accrued to the benefit of the capital owners. And it was only when governments came in and instituted health codes and labor laws and things like that that you started seeing a broader distribution and social safety nets and FDR and all different stuff like that really allowed everybody to benefit from all of that innovation. Left to market forces, I'm not sure it would have ended the way we tend to think it ended.
Yeah.
So coming back to your question, I've been fascinated by this idea. Elon Musk and others talk about universal high income, and then you have Bernie Sanders issuing challenges to Elon of saying, hey, Mr. Musk, tell me, how's that going to play out? And Elon doesn't really answer that question. And on that podcast yesterday, he didn't really either. So that's what's been animating me a bit, trying to drive an answer to that question. We won't have time to go into all the details of what I'd propose, but let me start off with a comment and then a thought experiment, if you'll allow me 2 more minutes of stream of consciousness.
Take as long as you want to go. We can go as long as you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
The comment, and then I'll try and substantiate this better, but the comment is that we are accustomed to think of unemployment economically, not about meaning and substance and how we spend our days, but at least at a financial level. We tend to think about unemployment as being catastrophic, and it historically always was. There's Acon's law, which found that approximately 1% of unemployment yielded a 2% contraction in GDP. So you've got one person less making stuff, you've got one person less consuming stuff, and then other people get fired because they're consuming less, and you get into a spiral, and it's not good.
Yeah.
But let me talk you through a thought experiment to drive home just how different this kind of unemployment could be. So if any of your listeners kind of think through, if they were gifted an Optimus, some kind of a doppelganger, some kind of look-alike that was indistinguishable from them, and they sent it to work in their place tomorrow. So just as a thought experiment, you send in, or if you work on a computer, you just have an AI step in and pretend to be you. And you're at the beach with your mates, playing ball and spending more time with your kids, and you're working out, and you're sleeping better and all that good stuff. Think through the economics of what happened here. Now, you keep getting a salary because your boss didn't notice that it's not you turning up at work anymore. So you're fine, you're happy. Your boss is pretty happy because you suddenly seem to work a lot better, make fewer mistakes, you don't seem to take many breaks, and you're much more pleasant than he remembered you to be. And this is something wild because you're not working and you're economically just fine, and your boss is actually, his productivity has gone up because he sent in the bot in your stead. Now, what that shows is that before we talk about policies, just that thought experiment shows that this is a radically different kind of unemployment, because it's unemployment that doesn't create scarcity, it creates surplus. There is more. If the whole economy is production and consumption, production goes up. We're not thinking of unemployment as raising production. Production goes up. There is more. The challenge is one of distribution, because there's absolutely no shortage. And even the capital owners want some degree of redistribution because they need customers who can buy stuff. So I think that thought experiment just drives home, and you can scale it up to 50 million people, 100 million people, or ultimately at the limit to the entire economy. And you can see how at 100% unemployment, GDP would be much bigger than it is today.
Yeah.
I think that the way to capture that and distribute it is probably comprised of a couple of components, probably more than a couple, but I tend to think in terms of a sales tax as being a pretty helpful tool. In America, it's a bit more fragmented. In places like Europe and elsewhere, VAT is a pretty standard fare. But you're going to see, if I'm right, and if all of this comes to pass, and if AI displaces humans, you'll see deflation.
Yeah.
A car without a driver is cheaper. A lawyer without a lawyer, a doctor without a doctor, everything becomes cheaper. And that's before you even get to robots, humanoid robots taking over the rest of the stuff. And you could imagine a situation where I'd be in favor of either UBI, or I'm actually thinking in terms of negative income tax, which is a slight variation on that. And it says, today you only start paying income tax above a certain level of income. Here it would say below a certain level of income tax pays you. And if really what it is, it's implementing a floor on your earning capability. Nobody will earn less than X. Now, today, no government can afford for that X to be pretty big. But I've run the numbers and I've built these models. And if you manage to capture some of all of that surplus, that X could be very big. In the models that I ran, a household with 2 unemployed parents would live in what is today reserved for the top 20% of the population. You could have everybody would be upper middle class. Nobody would be poor. And the mechanisms for capturing it, so as I started saying, deflation could be countered with a rising purchase tax. Deflation isn't necessarily great, so you could afford to raise that. And if you ring-fenced that delta and said that this is in order to help finance, this was caused by AI, is the displacement of labor that enabled this. We're going to use those proceeds in order to help the labor that was displaced. And I don't think it'd be smart without a big international consortium to raise capital gains tax or corporate taxes. But if profits are going to soar, tax revenue is going to soar without raising the rate. If you make twice as much, you pay twice as much without your rates being touched. So you won't be scared off by that. But governments could ring fence that delta, say, okay, this has been our revenue chart for the last X years. If it suddenly goes like this, that delta is AI caused, and we're going to take that portion of the government proceeds. And by the numbers that I run, you take those two things and a few other things, that would be sufficient to actually deliver a high universal income to everybody who lost their jobs in a few years' time. Not on day one, but once AGI arrives. And the nice thing is they're connected, right? If there's no AGI, then unemployment won't be so rampant. And as it grows, it's self-financing. You're taking the surplus that the AI creates in order to finance a universal basic and ultimately a universal high income.
Fascinating. No, I really appreciate you sharing that. Do you have a few more minutes, Daniel? Because I actually want to pick your brain a little bit more. Is it okay if 5-10 more minutes? Yeah. So one of the things that's super interesting there is assuming that in this new economy, as we have many times in the past, we'll adjust to a new reality where 100 years ago there's no way in hell that I do this job. I just started as a hobby, but I'm literally speaking to you, the CEO of one of the leading companies in AI, and we're just chatting. And then there's going to be, I don't know how this happened, tens of thousands of people are going to watch this on the internet, hundreds of thousands of people are going to watch this on the internet. Okay. And that is a beautiful, phenomenal thing. And so, humanity has shown over and over again that it's able to adjust to that really, really well. The one thing that's different about this transition is the speed of it in the digital world definitely is different than previous ones that we've experienced, I would say. So like the way the wave of how this is transforming digital work is fascinating. Whereas one hand, it's coming in and it's allowing companies like Lemonade to be transformed, the operational leverage of the company is transformed because of that. But on the flip side, it's given somebody like me a tool set in Claude Code and Replit and whatever to build my own tools. Whereas in the past, I would have to pay a developer tens of thousands of dollars to build something that I built for $50, right? So that's an incredible thing. But then once we start getting into the robotics land, and sort of the one thing you mentioned earlier is like this is you have a relationship of capital and labor in this new world. It's like the people that have the capital are the ones that can actually get the labor going. How do we avoid the scenario where all of us that are fortunate to have capital hoard all the physical labor resources and it doesn't, and there's no capacity for the ones that don't own capital, which is like in the United States, something like half of the population doesn't own stocks. They don't own anything, right? They don't own any assets. They're just paycheck to paycheck. What happens to the bottom half of the population where they don't have access to actually set these things into motion because they don't have the capital, right? How do you think about that equation? That's the one that freaks me the hell out. I'm going to be completely honest. Like, I mean, this is obviously going to be enormously beneficial for many people, but it also has these gigantic risks to it, and this is why we're talking about it. But that's one that really sort of gets me thinking a lot, because then, is there a precedent where the ones with capital get locked into this new economy, and the ones that have capital are the ones that make all the decisions, and then nobody else can enter it because we're all just going to hoard the robots, right? How do you think about that?
I'm going to say something that you and many of your listeners won't like, but I'm in favor of taxing and redistributing. I'm leery of and don't share in the common founder Silicon Valley notion that founders deserve all their fortunes. I think it takes a village to make a millionaire. Your kindergarten teacher and your school teacher and the doctors who looked after you and the people who paved the roads, and everybody and the people who came before you and you learned from, and the people who were terrible examples that you learned from. And there's a lot of luck. There's a lot of serendipity. And even if you say, oh no, it's my skills, it's not my luck. Well, what did you do to get your skills? There are consequences. They're the result of nature and nurture, your genes and your environment, and you can't take much credit for your genes, and you can't take any credit for your environment either. So I think some humility is called for, and with it, you start feeling lucky. I think that's an appropriate thing for people who have done well to feel. And with that, a sense of, there but for the grace of God go I kind of thing, which should engender a willingness to share in the fortune. I think that's a better vibe for entrepreneurs in general. That's my we're just talking here about values and perception.
Yeah. I
think that gets compounded. We can debate that in today's world. And, my brain is X and your brain is 2X, and, therefore you deserve everything that you have and I don't, whatever. If it's neither of our brains and neither of our bodies that is doing it, and we are just generating wealth without breaking a sweat and without giving it a thought, I think the meritocracy argument becomes much harder to defend. You just have more capital than me. That's all there is to it. You are not working harder or smarter or faster. In what sense is that a meritocracy, X years hence? And so I also think it's enlightened self-interest. I think ultimately capital owners don't want to live. In the last few years, the sale of private islands have gone through the roof, as has very high-level security details for billionaires. But I'm not counting myself as I don't have an island and I don't have a security detail. But,
not yet.
We collectively don't want, including I think the successful people, don't want to live in that world or that level of gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And as intolerable as it was historically, in an era of true abundance, is just abhorrent. It is just abhorrent. Yeah. Why should there be poverty in the age of AI and robotics? So for all of those reasons, I think some way of capturing a portion of all that surplus and distributing it, and I've just proposed a specific mechanics with certain taxes, but if it's not that, some other situation, there'll be so much of it to go around. The right thing to do is to make sure that nobody is left behind. And I'll say one last thing. It's in the interest of the business owners and the entrepreneurs, not only because they don't live in that world, but because we may never get to that world if we don't make sure that everybody is along for the ride. Globalization was great on average. GDPs benefited from globalization, but huge parts of America did not.
So true.
The coasts, I'm generalizing, the coasts did and the Rust Belt didn't. And that led to all manner of disruption and, opioid abuse and political disruptions. And I think it's not good enough to think about what makes the world a better place on average. And AI will clearly make it better on average. You want to think about those who are left behind, because otherwise that sabotages the whole effort.
Yeah.
Nobody should be left behind in this. You can become even richer, fine, but nobody should become poorer because of AI and they're losing their jobs. It's a basic compensation principle of you're going to pollute the river, pay for it. Why should I suffer because you did something to get rich?
Yeah.
Huge swaths of the population are going to suffer because we implemented AI. We have to think of a way of taxing that, making you pay so that nobody is left behind. And if you don't do that, then you get the Luddites. Then you'll get people demonstrating. You remember what happened in Hollywood 2 years ago.
100%.
And there'll be quiet sabotage and there'll be vocal and riotous sabotage. The best path to rapid adoption of AI is making sure that everybody's on the gravy train. Everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think like the inescapable reality here, and you sort of touched on it a little bit, is market forces left to their own devices, especially under capitalism in the age of AI, unless humanity is introduced and we make decisions to ensure that everybody comes along for the ride, will lead to a dystopian future. I think that's just the conclusion. If there's no humanity here, capitalism and our current system, whatever we want to call this future positive system, whatever that is, but the current system left to its own devices will generate terrible results if we just keep going down this gravy train, or not even the gravy train. If we keep going down this, the decoupling of human and labor and just capital and labor, by default, most of the population just gets left behind completely. So we have to do something radically different, and we have to ensure that, I think to your point, it's such a good one. Everybody has to feel like a winner. Everybody's new life has to be better than their old life. I think it's that simple, and we need a way to ensure that we can quantify that, but also we need to make sure that people actually feel that, right? Because one of the things that drives me nuts, and I sometimes see this in politics, is like, politicians will say, "Look, the numbers are good. Like, you shouldn't be feeling this way. The numbers are good." That is the craziest thing to say, because how a person feels, and if they feel like, you could be making more money, but if you're doing a shitty job and you're working 80-hour weeks and you barely see your family and you can't sleep because you're stressed out, that money doesn't matter. It's about the well-being and the humanity of the person that's the most important. And I really applaud you for being so willing to share that viewpoint, because it's kind of like we sort of hear. Your camp doesn't get shared too much, especially in Silicon Valley land, like you said. It gets shared more on, with different framing from like the Bernie Sanders and the AOC here in the United States. But it's like, unless we do something similar to that, where we ensure where we're sure everybody can benefit, this is not going to work. So, yeah. Well, thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you for
being concerned about these things and giving them thought and giving me a platform to chat about them. It's welcome.
Yeah, of course. It's much needed. Yeah. Okay. Where can people find you? Where can people find Lemonade, Daniel?
Lemonade is lemonade.com. That's pretty easy. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn, but I don't use either of those a hell of a lot. So
smart.
And you find me on Farzad. That's where you got to go to hear what I have to say.